David McGreavy's story begins not with horror but with ordinariness, a working-class upbringing, a young man trying to find direction in life, and a family who saw him as quiet, polite, and dependable. Born in 1951 in Southport, Lancashire, England, he was the second of 6 children in a military family. His father, Thomas, served in the Royal Navy, a profession that brought both pride and instability to their home life. Constant relocations meant David's childhood was fragmented. He rarely stayed in one place long enough to form lasting friendships, and discipline was rigid. His father demanded obedience, and David often absorbed the brunt of that strictness. What appeared to outsiders as a well-kept, disciplined family masked a pattern of emotional distance and bottled frustration, the kind that would later explode in the most unimaginable way. By his late teens, McGreavy followed in his father's footsteps and joined the Royal Navy. It was, for a time, the one structured environment that made sense to him. The discipline, the routine, the order, it fit a mind that craved structure. But the military life also revealed the cracks in his personality. He struggled to follow authority when it clashed with his impulses. He had trouble controlling his temper, and his fellow sailors described him as easily frustrated, especially after drinking. Alcohol would become a recurring shadow in his life, a trigger that stripped away the fragile calm he tried to maintain. After being discharged from the Navy in 1971, McGreavy drifted through a series of odd jobs. He worked as a laborer, a bartender, and eventually found himself back living with his parents in Worcester. His family saw him as aimless but harmless, a man with no real plan but no history of violence either. He was, in many ways, the kind of man people trusted without much thought. He seemed simple, even likable. And when he met Clive and Elsie Ralph, a young couple who needed help with their children, they saw him as a reliable friend, someone willing to lend a hand. Clive and Elsie lived at 45 Gilham Street in Worcester, a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. Clive worked nights as a lorry driver, often leaving Elsie alone with their 3 small children, Paul, 4, Dawn, 2, and Samantha, just 9 months old. The Ralphs struggled financially, like many young families at the time, but they were close-knit and kind-hearted. When David moved in as a lodger in early 1973, it felt like a perfect arrangement. He'd pay a small rent, help with the children, and offer some company to Elsie while Clive worked nights. For months, it worked perfectly. Neighbors saw David pushing the pram, playing with the kids in the small garden, even helping with chores. He became part of the family's rhythm. But under that calm domestic scene, something was beginning to fester. David had started drinking heavily again. He was often seen at the local pub, downing pints until his speech slurred and his patience shortened. Those who met him at the bar said he was friendly enough until someone annoyed him. Then his temper could flare fast. He wasn't violent in public, but his words grew sharp and his eyes darkened. It was the kind of anger that felt out of proportion, the kind that revealed deeper instability. By April 1973, tension in the Ralph home was quietly building. David was falling behind on his rent, and Elsie had begun to notice his drinking. Clive, meanwhile, had gently reminded him to be more responsible, especially since the children adored him. David took those reminders personally. Beneath his surface obedience was a growing resentment toward authority, a hangover from his Navy days and his father's strictness. But still, he stayed on. He cared for the Ralph children when needed, and on the night of April 13th, a Friday, Elsie asked him to babysit while she went to the pub down the street. She had complete faith in him. He'd done it before. The children loved him. There was no reason to suspect anything could go wrong. It was one of those chilly English spring evenings, the kind that carries a damp chill through narrow streets. Elsie left around 8 p.m., leaving the 3 children in their beds and David in charge. She promised to be home by 10. The house was quiet, the children asleep upstairs, and David, left alone, poured himself a drink. What followed in the next few hours remains one of the most horrific acts of violence in British criminal history. An eruption so brutal that even hardened police officers struggled to process what they found. At around 10:15 that night, Elsie returned home expecting to find David watching television or reading the paper and her children asleep. Instead, as she reached the front door, she saw smoke and smelled something burning. The door was locked and the lights were off. Confused, she went to a neighbor to ask for help. When they entered the home, the scene inside was chaotic and the children were gone. Panic set in instantly. Elsie screamed their names, but no answer came. Within minutes, the police were called. As officers arrived, what they discovered shocked them to their core. The first horrific sight was in the backyard, the small garden where the Ralph children had played just that morning. There, impaled on a metal fence post, was the lifeless body of 2-year-old Dawn. Nearby, another body, that of 4-year-old Paul, lay mutilated. 9-month-old Samantha was found nearby, her tiny body brutally desecrated. The violence was beyond comprehension. It wasn't just murder, it was rage, humiliation, annihilation. And the killer had made no effort to hide it. In fact, he seemed almost to have displayed it, a grotesque exhibition of madness. The police immediately began searching for David McGreavy. He was nowhere to be found in the house or the neighborhood. Neighbors told officers they'd seen him walking down the street earlier, his clothes stained, his gait uneven as if drunk or dazed. A massive manhunt began through Worcester that night. Within hours, McGreavy was found less than 2 miles away, staggering near a railway bridge. When officers approached him, he didn't resist. He simply muttered, "What's the matter? Is it about the kids?" Then, almost casually, he added, "It was me." At the police station, the full confession spilled out almost too easily. McGreavy said that one of the children, baby Samantha, had been crying and he couldn't get her to stop. He'd been drinking. The noise, the frustration, the helplessness, something snapped. He said he grabbed her, shook her, and when she continued crying, he slammed her head against a hard surface. The sound enraged him further. Then, he said, the other children woke up and began crying too. In what he described as a blind rage, he attacked them both, strangling, beating, and stabbing them. Once they were dead, he mutilated their bodies and took them outside. He said later he didn't know why. He just wanted to get rid of them. Police officers described his confession as chillingly calm. There was no sign of remorse, no panic, just detachment, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. When asked if he knew what he'd done, he said quietly, "Yes, I killed them." He even led police to the garden, explaining how he'd used a pickaxe handle and a carving knife, and then described in detail how he positioned the children afterward. Detectives, some with decades of experience, were shaken. One officer later said it was the worst crime scene he'd ever encountered, pure evil, without reason or motive. The community of Worcester was paralyzed with grief and rage. The Ralph family was shattered beyond comprehension. Elsie had to be sedated after identifying her children's bodies, and Clive, who had been at work that night, collapsed upon hearing the news. Neighbors couldn't fathom how the quiet young lodger, the man they'd seen playing with the kids in the yard, could commit such atrocities. The newspapers quickly branded him the monster of Worcester. But soon another nickname would stick, the real Friday the 13th killer. The investigation was straightforward in evidence but impossible to explain psychologically. There was no premeditation, no history of violence, no sexual motive, no clear reason, just a spontaneous eruption of rage. Psychiatrists who later examined McGreavy said he suffered from a pathological inability to control aggression, particularly when under the influence of alcohol and stress. They found no signs of psychosis or schizophrenia. He knew what he was doing, he just didn't care in that moment. That distinction between insanity and moral vacancy would define his trial and the public debate that followed. When the case went to trial later that year, the courtroom was packed. The details were so disturbing that much of the evidence was withheld from public record. Reporters described the atmosphere as tense and revolted. Some jurors cried openly. McGreavy's defense did not dispute his guilt. There was overwhelming evidence and his own confession. Instead, his lawyers argued for diminished responsibility, citing emotional instability and alcoholism. The prosecution, however, maintained that he acted with full awareness and intent. He had killed 3 defenseless children and desecrated their bodies. There was no mercy to be found in his actions. The jury took only minutes to reach a verdict, guilty on all counts. On June 28, 1973, David McGreavy was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge called his crimes the most horrifying and inhuman he had ever encountered. McGreavy was led away without expression, eyes vacant, as the court erupted in stunned silence. Inside prison, McGreavy became a symbol of pure evil in the British press. Other inmates shunned or attacked him. He was moved frequently between prisons for his own safety. Psychiatrists continued to study him, fascinated by the absence of clear motive. When asked years later why he'd done it, McGreavy said only, "I was drunk and they cried." It was a statement that sent chills through everyone who heard it, not because of its simplicity, but because of its lack of humanity. In the decades that followed, McGreavy's name faded from headlines but never from memory. For the people of Worcester, his crime was a permanent scar. The Ralph family moved away, changed their names, and tried to rebuild what was left of their lives. Elsie, especially, carried the unbearable weight of guilt for having trusted him, for having left that night. She lived under the shadow of that one decision for the rest of her life. Inside the British prison system, McGreavy was often described as a model prisoner. He took up gardening, painting, and menial jobs. He never attempted escape, rarely caused trouble, and followed every rule. To prison staff, he was quiet and compliant. But to the outside world, he remained a monster, a man whose crimes were so savage that no amount of good behavior could ever erase them. Life behind bars did not begin with peace for David McGreavy. From the first day of his sentence in 1973, his name spread through the British prison system like wildfire. Even among violent offenders, child killers held the lowest place, despised and targeted. McGreavy's reputation preceded him. Guards whispered about the crime. Inmates hissed threats as he walked past. Within weeks, he was attacked twice, stabbed with a sharpened spoon and beaten in the showers. Prison officials quickly realized he could not survive in a general population block. He was transferred to a high-security unit reserved for inmates whose crimes drew the most violent hatred. It was there, surrounded by other infamous killers, that McGreavy began his long descent into anonymity. He adapted quickly. Years of discipline from his naval background taught him to follow orders and maintain composure. Prison records described him as docile and cooperative, a man who never raised his voice and did whatever was asked of him. He spent hours in isolation, reading and working in the prison gardens. He rarely spoke of the past, and when questioned about the murders, he often answered in short, flat sentences. "It's done," or "There's nothing to explain." Psychiatrists noted that he seemed detached from his own actions, not in denial, but disconnected, as though he'd amputated that part of himself. The British media, however, refused to forget. Newspapers printed his photograph, a young man with cold eyes and a ghost of a smile, beside the words "Monster of Worcester." For years, the details of the crime haunted readers. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the complete lack of motive. Many struggled to understand how a man could kill 3 children he cared for, children who called him Uncle David. The phrase "Real Friday the 13th Killer" emerged in tabloid headlines, cementing him as a kind of embodiment of senseless evil. And yet, inside prison walls, time did its slow work. The public's anger gradually moved on to new horrors, new names, new cases. McGreavy stayed silent, serving his time in obscurity. In the late 1980s, something shifted. McGreavy was transferred to a lower security facility after more than 15 years of good behavior. Reports described him as a prisoner who presents no management problems. He had taken part in therapy sessions, literacy programs, and art workshops. He painted landscapes, worked in the greenhouse, and wrote short letters to prison staff thanking them for their patience. One guard said he was the perfect inmate, polite, quiet, and predictable. But beneath that apparent calm, psychologists remained cautious. His original psychiatric evaluations had warned that while McGreavy was not insane, he had a profound deficit in empathy, a man capable of mimicking normal emotion without feeling it. For the families of the victims, the idea of him being moved to a lower security prison felt like a betrayal. They had believed life meant what it sounded like, that he would never walk free again. Each new report of his progress reignited old pain. Elsie and Clive Ralph, though separated by then, both continued to protest every development in his case. They lived with an unhealed wound that no therapy or apology could touch. For them, there was no rehabilitation, only an endless echo of that night. McGreavy's time in the 1990s passed quietly. He avoided trouble-earned privileges and took part in a restorative justice program designed to help long-term prisoners confront their crimes. Those who worked with him said he often seemed distant, as if he were reading from a script rather than speaking from the heart. When asked if he regretted what he did, he would say, "Yes, of course," but his tone lacked conviction. Some psychologists speculated that his remorse was intellectual, not emotional. He understood the horror of his acts but did not feel it. Still, his record remained spotless. By 2006, McGreavy had served over 30 years, well beyond his 20-year minimum term. His name appeared before a parole review board for the first time. The public was outraged when they learned of it. The Ralph family led protests, collecting signatures and speaking to the press. "He took everything from us," Elsie said in an interview. "How can he ever deserve freedom?" The board ultimately rejected his release, citing concerns about media hostility and risk of psychological instability under public pressure. But they noted his progress and recommended continued preparation for eventual open conditions. That small phrase, "eventual open conditions," sent waves of fury across the country. The British justice system has always balanced punishment with rehabilitation, but in cases like McGreavy's, the concept was hard to stomach. The crime was too shocking, the suffering too deep. For years, successive parole reviews produced the same result: recognition of good behavior but denial of release. McGreavy, meanwhile, continued to age quietly behind walls that had long become his world. He kept to himself, worked in the kitchens, and never once caused disciplinary trouble. To the officers who dealt with him daily, he was a nonentity, an old prisoner who followed rules and avoided eye contact. In 2009, after 36 years in custody, McGreavy was transferred again, this time to an open prison, a facility where inmates live in dormitory-style housing and can work outside under supervision. The move was highly controversial. Victims, families accused the justice system of betrayal. The media resurrected old headlines, and television segments replayed the story, showing black and white photos of the smiling Ralph children beside images of McGreavy's mugshot. He was now an aging man with gray hair and sunken cheeks, but the sight of him still stirred raw anger. Authorities defended the transfer, insisting that decades of psychological evaluations had deemed him low risk. He had expressed genuine remorse, they said, and understood the magnitude of his crimes. Yet every time those words appeared in the news, the public response was the same: disbelief. How could a man who had committed such unspeakable acts ever be considered safe? Inside the open prison, McGreavy lived a monotonous but peaceful life. He worked in the gardens, attended therapy sessions, and spent most of his free hours reading. Fellow inmates described him as quiet and isolated, a man who avoided conversation about the past. He refused interviews, ignored letters from journalists, and kept his opinions to himself. One former inmate later claimed that McGreavy never spoke of remorse but once said softly, "They'll never let me go, and maybe that's right." Whether it was genuine acceptance or resignation, no one could tell. The parole process in Britain is lengthy and meticulous, involving risk assessments, psychological evaluations, and community impact reports. McGreavy's case became one of the most scrutinized in modern British legal history. Each time his name resurfaced, public outrage flared anew. Tabloids called him the child killer who wants freedom. Editorials demanded that life sentences mean life. Politicians were questioned, victims' rights groups mobilized, and the Ministry of Justice faced pressure to tighten release rules. McGreavy himself said nothing. He lived as though invisible, his world confined to narrow routines: awake, work, eat, read, sleep. By 2013, 40 years had passed since the murders. McGreavy was 62. He had spent two-thirds of his life behind bars. In that year, the parole board once again reviewed his case. The decision was delayed several times amid growing media attention. Reports indicated that psychiatrists found no evidence of psychopathy and that his behavior over 4 decades had been exemplary. But opposition from the victim's family remained fierce. Elsie Ralph, then in her 70s, told reporters, "He doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as anyone else." The board deferred its ruling, citing public safety and political sensitivity. Meanwhile, life inside prison had become McGreavy's default existence. Those who supervised him said he had no friends, no visitors, and no plans for life outside. His only consistent trait was obedience. He had, in essence, become institutionalized, a man shaped entirely by confinement. He worked in prison maintenance, grew vegetables, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. To the few staff members who interacted closely with him, he appeared empty, a man without ambition, anger, or hope. Whether that emptiness was peace or simply emotional death was a question no one could answer. Then, in 2018, after 45 years in custody, the unthinkable happened. The parole board ruled that David McGreavy could be released. The decision sent shockwaves through Britain. The board concluded that he had demonstrated considerable self-control and insight, and that his risk of reoffending was extremely low. He would be given a new identity and placed under strict license conditions, meaning any violation or media contact could send him back to prison. The report emphasized his age, his clean disciplinary record, and his participation in years of therapy. To the system, he was rehabilitated. To the public, he was a monster walking free. When news broke, the reaction was immediate and furious. Newspaper front pages screamed outrage. Talk shows debated whether such crimes could ever be forgiven. Politicians called for inquiries into parole procedures. For the Ralph family, the decision reopened wounds that had never healed. "He took my bobbies," Elsie said, her voice trembling in an interview. 45 years doesn't erase that. He should never be free. But the law was clear. He had served his minimum term, met all requirements, and shown no ongoing danger to society. The parole board's decision stood. In 2019, quietly and without public announcement, McGreavy was released from prison under a new identity. His exact location was kept secret, protected by anonymity orders to prevent vigilante attacks. The only clue the public received was that he would live in a supervised community somewhere in southern England. For weeks, the story dominated headlines. Reporters scoured towns for signs of him, photographers staked out halfway houses, and angry social media campaigns demanded to know where he was. But the government refused to release any details, citing security and legal privacy rights. The image of an elderly McGreavy, frail, gray, and stooped, circulated briefly in a leaked photo, reigniting debate. Could time and age truly erase what he'd done? Could a man capable of such horror ever be trusted to live among others? Experts on criminal rehabilitation weighed in. Some argued that decades of controlled behavior, therapy, and introspection could indeed neutralize violent tendencies, especially when alcohol, his main trigger, was permanently banned. Others countered that certain acts reveal a fundamental defect in empathy that cannot be repaired. "You can teach control," one psychologist said, "but you can't teach humanity where none exists." McGreavy himself offered no public statement. He slipped into obscurity, living under his new identity, monitored by probation officers and restricted by curfews and contact bans. He was forbidden from returning to Worcester or making any attempt to contact the Ralph family. In effect, he became a ghost, alive, but erased. The story of David McGreavy became more than just a tale of murder. It became a test of how far society's belief in rehabilitation could go. His release sparked parliamentary debates and renewed calls for harsher sentencing in child murder cases. For some, it was proof that the justice system had failed, that monsters could outlast public outrage. For others, it was a difficult reminder that even the worst offenders exist within a system built on principles of law, not vengeance. Yet behind every argument, one truth remained unshakable. 3 innocent children, Paul, Dawn, and Samantha, lost their lives in a moment of drunken rage that no therapy or prison sentence could undo. Their graves in Worcester became quiet places of remembrance, visited by few, forgotten by many, but forever marked by the brutality of that night in April 1973. And somewhere, far from the place where it all began, the man who killed them lived out his final years in silence, carrying the weight of his name and the shadow of what he'd done, a ghost of a life that had long since forfeited the right to normality. The years after David McGreavy's release were marked by silence, a calculated, legally enforced invisibility. No interviews, no sightings, no public statements. The man once called the real Friday, the 13th killer, had vanished into a system designed to erase him from society's view. Yet the world around him had changed beyond recognition. The Britain he returned to was not the one he had left in 1973. Cameras watched every street, social media turned whispers into storms, and true crime had become entertainment. Even with a new name and identity, he could not fully escape the weight of what he had done. The Home Office had ensured his release conditions were among the strictest ever imposed on a British parolee. McGreavy was barred from using the internet freely, contacting the press, or forming unsupervised relationships. He lived in a controlled environment, possibly a halfway house, where every movement was logged. He had to attend mandatory therapy sessions, submit to random checks, and report to his probation officer multiple times a week. Even his appearance was reportedly altered, his hair cut differently, glasses worn to disguise his face. The anonymity was both protection and punishment, a life of quiet exile. Yet even in secrecy, the specter of his crime followed him. Every few years, newspapers would revisit the case, particularly on the anniversary of the murders. Journalists wrote retrospectives, podcast hosts analyzed the psychology behind his violence, and documentaries replayed the black and white photos of the victims. For many, the case was the embodiment of random evil, a reminder that horror can emerge from the most ordinary settings. Every mention of his name reopened old anger, and though few knew where he lived, there were always rumors that he'd been spotted in various parts of the UK. Each time, local communities erupted in outrage, demanding he be moved elsewhere. The authorities never confirmed or denied these reports, only stating that Mr. McGreavy remains under supervision and poses no risk. To those who studied violent crime, McGreavy's case became a haunting lesson in how unpredictable violence can be. Criminologists and psychologists revisited his file repeatedly, searching for signs, early warnings that might explain what turned a quiet babysitter into a child killer. They found fragments of clues, a strict upbringing that repressed emotion, a history of frustration and anger, alcohol dependency, and social immaturity. But even put together, these did not form a full picture. He was not a sadist in the clinical sense, nor a serial killer seeking pleasure in pain. He was something more terrifying, an ordinary man who, in a brief, uncontrollable rage, crossed into monstrosity. His case became a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with madness or malice. Sometimes, it appears as a momentary fracture in the human mind. The debate surrounding his release continued to ripple through British politics and public opinion. Lawmakers questioned whether the justice system's emphasis on rehabilitation had gone too far. Opinion columns asked if true forgiveness was even possible for such crimes. The parole board defended its decision with procedural logic. That risk assessment, not public emotion, determined parole eligibility. But that reasoning never comforted the people who remembered the victims. To them, the release of David McGreavy was not justice fulfilled. It was justice undone by time. For the Ralph family, the decades had taken their toll. Clive and Elsie, once a young couple full of hope, had long gone their separate ways, each bearing grief in different forms. Elsie lived quietly, her life defined by survival rather than recovery. She never forgave herself for trusting him that night. In her later interviews, her voice carried both pain and exhaustion. "You never stop seeing it," she once said softly. "You never stop hearing them." When she learned of McGreavy's release, she did not shout or cry. She simply said, "He will answer to God now." In Worcester, the old house at 45 Gilham Street was torn down years earlier, replaced by newer homes. But residents still spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the land itself remembered. Some locals avoided walking near that stretch after dark. The story had become legend, part of the city's dark folklore, a cautionary tale whispered across generations. For those who grew up there, the words Friday the 13th carried an eerie resonance, not because of superstition, but because it was real. It had happened in their own neighborhood. In the years following his release, McGreavy's anonymity shielded him from public scrutiny, but not from the weight of isolation. Those who understood the parole system knew that life under a new identity is rarely freedom in the true sense. Every relationship, every social interaction must be disclosed to authorities. Every job must be pre-approved. Every step outside carries the risk of recognition. For McGreavy, that meant living as a ghost, a man alive but stripped of identity, tethered to secrecy. Psychologists who worked with long-term lifers often spoke of a phenomenon called institutional death. After decades in confinement, prisoners lose the ability to function emotionally in normal society. They exist, but not fully. They follow rules because rules are all they understand. For McGreavy, who spent 45 years in rigid control, freedom may have felt like another form of imprisonment. Without the structure of bars and schedules, he reportedly became reclusive, spending most of his time alone. He was said to avoid small talk, television, and newspapers. He was alive but empty. What made his story so haunting was not just the horror of his crime, but the absence of explanation. Why did a man with no history of violence suddenly destroy 3 innocent lives in such a monstrous way? Decades of psychiatric evaluation never found a satisfying answer. Some suggested deep-seated resentment toward authority, that in his drunken rage, the children's cries triggered feelings of helplessness and rejection rooted in his childhood. Others believed it was a simple, terrifying truth.